My name is Patricia Kane, and I'm the Friends of American Arts curator of American Decorative Arts, and I was the lead curator for art and industry in early America, Rhode Island Furniture 1650 to 1830, an exhibition which provides a chronological overview of the furniture of the colony and then state of Rhode Island, which is now on view in our Sussman fourth floor exhibition galleries. And it will be on view until January 8th. There's really a very small coterie of people in this world who are interested in early American furniture. And so when we were thinking about this exhibition, we were really searching for ways to give it a bigger historical and cultural context so that it might be more intelligible to a wider sort of general audience. And so there is a select number of objects in the exhibition that address some of these economic and cultural issues. In many ways, Rhode Island was really very different from its surrounding New England colonies, and we sought to enlarge visitors' really understanding of those differences. And so with the education department, we conceived of a 3-lecture series, the second of which is being presented today. And these lectures are supported by the Martin A. Ryerson Fund. And the lectures discuss important communities within colonial Rhode Island whose material culture is less abundant than the furniture. The first of the series, which was given about a week ago, explored the topic of indigenous peoples who lived in Rhode Island when the colonies arrived, and then the interaction of those peoples with the settlers. Today's lecture will discuss the Africans who were brought to Rhode Island in the robust slave trade that operated in colonial Rhode Island. And the final lecture on November 6th addresses the Jewish settlers who began to come to the colony in the late 17th century, drawn there by the prevailing attitude of religious toleration. The speaker this afternoon, Keith Stokes, has been involved in the study of Newport's African American community for many years. With his wife, Teresa Gusman Stokes, he founded the 1696 Heritage Group, named for the first documented slave ship, the Seaflower, that arrived in Newport, Rhode Island in 1696. The 1696 Heritage Group is a historical consulting firm with a mission to increase knowledge and information about African American heritage, and Keith is the vice president of the group. He has served as an advisor for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, along with serving on numerous regional and national historic preservation boards, including Newport's Toro Synagogue Foundation, the Preservation Society of Newport County, and the Newport Historical Society. He has a long and distinguished career in business and community development, with degrees from Cornell University and the University of Chicago. His past professional positions have included executive director of the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation and executive director of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce. He is now with the Providence-based May 4th Group as president for Strategic Economic Planning and Development. The title of his lecture today is American Irony, Religious Freedom and Slavery in Colonial Newport. Please join me in welcoming Keith Stokes.
Thank you, and it's great to be here, everyone. I think my most important credential is my daughter, Ashley, who's here with us today, is a 9th-generation Newporter. And I've always had the privilege and opportunity for years to present not only the history of Newport to a number of organizations, but the history of Newport through the lens of the African and later African-American people. The presentation I'm going to provide to you today was something my wife and I had developed a few years ago, working with the National Trust, to begin to provide further interpretation of the African experience in early America, particularly from the perspective of New England. In developing this story, one of the things that we found on a consistent basis is, which is the title here, was the fact that at the time of the settlement of New England in the 17th century, moving into the 18th century, many of the men and women and families that settled here were not looking for gold or wealth or riches. They were simply looking for a place where they could worship God freely without an oversight or a king or a queen or a royal governor. And that would bring some of the earliest Quaker communities, Jewish communities, some of the earliest and founding Christian groups from Baptists would all find their way to New England, and particularly to my home community of Newport in Rhode Island. At that exact same time, as we were establishing ourselves here in New England as a center of religious toleration, and in some case freedom, we were also quickly establishing ourselves in an involvement of African enslavement. In fact, by the mid-18th century, some of the leading slave ports of British North America are places like New London, Connecticut, Bristol, Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston, Massachusetts. So as we developed this presentation, what we thought we would do is talk less about slavery and the slave institution, because that's done enough, and it's done in some cases too much, but talk about the evolution of the African people. Who were they? These men, women, in many cases children. How did they arrive? Where did they live? Where did they work? How did they worship? And the whole point of this presentation is to talk about this irony of this community established by people who were persecuted by the way they worshiped versus these same individuals owning fellow human beings at the exact same time, and what type of conflicts were going on between their own dialogue with their own religion, their own communities and such, and how did these Africans do what we today call creatively survive despite these circumstances. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to give you one very, very important quote that comes from Ghana, and it's very relevant, very appropriate, because many of the Africans, if not about 80 to 85% of the Africans that we've sourced primary sources that arrived in New England came for what is today Ghana or Guinea. And this is a very important quote because what it basically says is that it's the human being that counts. It's not gold, it's not cloth, it's the human being. And in this presentation, you're going to have an opportunity to see not slaves, not chattel property, not beasts of the fields, but human beings. Now, as I said, Rhode Island, which I'm quite proud of, was established under what we call our lively experiment. And the four most important people in establishing and founding Rhode Island are certainly King Charles II, because his charter to Rhode Island on July 2nd, 1663 is an extraordinary charter. It is actually drafted by John Clark of Newport under the support of Roger Williams of Providence. And this charter, for the first time, at least in British law, allows for an establishment and an organization of a government where there begins the very basics of what today we see as separation of church and state. But what's even more important in that charter, it allows anyone to become a citizen, anyone who is a male Protestant Christian property owner to become a full citizen, but are not required to follow any official church or head of state. Now, for early 17th century, that's heady stuff, because for the most part, as the Europeans are exploring and settling in the New World, as it's called, they're bringing with them very strict requirements that we will now operate our government system under the king or the queen, under the Catholic Church, under the Protestant Church. But here in Rhode Island, and led by Roger Williams in Providence, John Clark and Ann Hutchinson on Aquidneck Island, which becomes Rhode Island, where Newport is situated, they had a very different feel. And their feel was, we need to separate this church and state environment. We need to allow anyone to live free of any possibility of persecution because they're not following a king or a queen or a royal decree on how they should worship God. That's heady stuff. In fact, Connecticut colony at one point starts to call Rhode Island Rogues Island, not because of pirates and not because of slavery or anything else, but because of this strange sense that we're going to bring in anyone and everyone at any time and will only lead to chaos and anarchy. And what's important about these early institutions is that they very quickly established some of the earliest religious institutions of their time. In Newport alone, you have, at your top left, Trinity Anglican Church, established in 1726. It's our parish, our family parish. Our organ is a gift of Handel himself. It's a very special place. Turrell's Synagogue, which I'm chairman of the board and have ancestors that are part of the founding there, dates back to the mid-17th century. The first Jews would arrive via Barbados or New York to Newport, and they would establish their own synagogue, which today is the oldest existing Jewish house of worship in North America, in Newport, still with an active Orthodox congregation. The Baptists were formed with Roger Williams in Providence. Roger Williams felt so strongly that there shouldn't be an organized religion. During his lifetime, he would never support the building of an actual church structure. There would be informal meetings in each and everyone's home. Everyone was an elder. They shared. The Newport Baptists were a little bit more pragmatic. So under John Clark, they would establish a church structure, initially in Middletown, Rhode Island, then later to move into Newport. And this structure that you see in the top right and in the center, the Unit Baptist Church, they were established very early on by the John Clark followers. Later, the Quakers would arrive by at least 1658, and by 1699, they would establish their Quaker meeting house. In fact, Newport had one of the largest, and if not the largest, Quaker community in the early origins of America, even well before Philadelphia. Today in Newport, if you have a chance to come, sometimes people go to the waterfront. They want to see the boats, they want to see the restaurants and all those things, and they're all wonderful. But we also have a community today called The Point, named after the Easton family. It was established as a Quaker community, and like downtown Philadelphia, the streets are not named after graven images or man, but it's named after nature and trees, Poplar Street, Cherry Street, and Walnut Street. It has one of the largest collection of 17th and 18th century existing Quaker homes in America. So Newport becomes literally this one stop for anyone and anyone who was simply persecuted because of their religion and their faith. In some of the most important early statements at that time, Roger Williams, God is too large to be housed under any one roof. Again, this belief that any one of us at any point have a connection to God, and we're not required to follow the teachings of a single priest or a minister or a single structure. It is something that goes with us. It's an inner light, our relationship with Jesus. Anne Hutchinson, who is one of my favorites, she talks about, must not I then entertain the saints because I must keep my conscience? Anne Hutchinson also goes out and suggests at the time, as they're beginning to enslave some of the indigenous people, she suggests that once they are baptized and are converted, aren't they one under one God? So it's important to understand that these men and women who settle in New England generally, but particularly in Rhode Island, they're not Spanish conquerors, they're not Portuguese maritime traders. They're not looking for riches and wealth for king or queen. They're just simply looking for a place where they can worship God and not have to look over their shoulder to be persecuted. It's a very special time and a very special place. And this is one thing I love to point out. Being a historian, but also running a Chamber of Commerce and living in Newport and growing up in Newport, one of the things that's always interesting to me when visitors come to Newport, and if you have, maybe you've seen it, they go to our Queen Anne Square on the waterfront off Thames Street. Our Trinity Church sits at the top. It's a white steeple church, and we have this beautiful expanse of a green that goes into our waterfront. And everyone comes there because it's the town center of Newport. It is not. In fact, the town center of Newport is on a place called Washington Square, earlier the parade. This center image is from a painting from a Hessian soldier that stayed over after the American Revolution, about circa 1810, and he's looking down into Washington Square. In the center is our brick marketplace that still exists, and that is ringed with homes. But what's most important about our Washington Square then and today is Newport is one of the few colonial New England communities at its town center or town square or parade grounds. It does not have a leading church structure at the top, an Anglican church or a Baptist church or a church structure to define the community to say, this is the leading community, this is the leading denomination. The men and women in Newport in the 17th and 18th century made a very specific decision not to allow any one place of worship to take center stage and be at the top of our commerce center and town center. And instead what they required that all of them would be built as simple, plain meeting houses in a semicircle around our town center. It's quite unique. So sometimes if you're back in Newport, it's something to look for. Look for the fact that all of our earliest churches and synagogue were all built in a semicircle around the town center, facing into the waterfront, but not any one takes center stage. The other neat thing is they were all required not to have any outward signs of adornment. So Trinity Anglican Church has a whale weather vane at the top. There's no crosses. Even Turrell's Synagogue is very plain meeting house style. You wouldn't know what place of worship from the exterior unless you went in. And what's most important about that, that tradition for the most part stays today. But as Newport is well established as a place for religious freedom, It also establishes itself. Most of these merchants, most of these religious groups were merchant traders, and they would take advantage of the deep natural channel in Narragansett Bay, the natural harbor, and they would establish themselves very early in the international trade. The trade at the time, what we sometimes call the triangular trade, was a trade between New England to West Africa, to the West Indies, and back to New England. And in the case of Newport, Newport perfected this. By 1750, Newport is singularly the largest slave trading port in British North America by number of ships, in tonnage, and products. Many of the Africans who would arrive to southern New England would come via Newport ships, and many would dock in Newport and be transported north to Boston and certainly west into Connecticut. And Newport is quite active in this. In fact, in 1755, the population of Newport is about 9,000 souls. About 3,000 are listed as enslaved, a few free enslaved Africans. So nearly a third of the population, one out of three people in Newport at that time would have been people from what is today Western Africa. Quite extraordinary. So who were these Africans, and what was their beginnings, and how did they begin to evolve and grow in this new environment? Well, the most important thing to recognize is Africans did not arrive here as a blank slate. They brought with them their language, their religion, their culture, their foodstuff, their music, and all of it became assimilated into early colonial American life. And what we do know from the primary records that we have is that by 1652, we know that Rhode Island already establishes a law to begin to eliminate slavery on Providence's plantations, but not the colony portion of Rhode Island. In fact, Roger Williams felt quite strongly that slavery should not be a part of the colony going forward. The merchants in Newport politely ignored Roger Williams and continued and built the slave and built the trade. We also know that by 1660, again, 3 years before even our charter was established, King Charles is already dictating that enslaved Africans, indigenous people, be converted to Christianity. This is an important act because a century later, it accelerates. And in a few minutes, you'll find that there's almost a race between particularly Christian denominations of taking these Africans and assimilating them into the household and their place of worship. It's almost unprecedented. There's an old saying in slave history, the further south you went, the worse your circumstance. In fact, slaves who were disobedient were threatened by being sold further south. So to be a house servant or a tradesman in New England is one circumstance as an enslaved African, but it's better than being in a tobacco plantation in the Virginia colonies, which is a lot better going further south in South Carolina with the mosquitoes and the malaria and the rice plantations. But no one wanted to be in a sugarcane or a coffee plantation in the West Indies. So again, that further north, that New England circumstance, because of the environment, because of the climate, Africans had an ability to further and more accelerate their assimilation into the households of early New England. It's also important to recognize, as I said before, most of these Africans we now know through primary and secondary documentation came from what is today Ghana and Guinea. Now, we know that for not only primary records, we also know from common sense. We are a British colony. We're not Spanish, we're not French, we're not Dutch, we're not Portuguese, we're a British colony. So you think of terms of where were the British establishing colonies and outposts in West Africa, in the West Indies, and lo and behold, there is that triangular connection. In the case of West Africa, it is in the Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, and Ananabo Castle in what is today Ghana. In the West Indies, it's Barbados at the further reaches, but it's largely Jamaica and Bahamas, and then certainly here in New England. So what we find is that these Africans were largely coming from what is today that Gold Coast region of Ghana. In a few minutes later, you'll find other cues and other information as Africans begin to reclaim traditions and names that are traditionally seen in Ghana to this day. So what was the worship and work and life together of these Africans in Colonial Newport? And again, what you saw in Colonial Newport was a larger scale, but you were seeing in smaller scale in similar circumstances in other locations in New England. Well, what we know is that many of the Africans who had arrived, as I said, came from what is the Gold Coast or the Rice Coast, largely Ghana. We also know that most of the Europeans who had settled as religious persecuted minority groups, so religion and your belief in religion and your free exercise of it was very important in households in the community. We also know that, for the most part, many of the Africans who would arrive would begin to be the workforce of the trades. In fact, they were a large part of the trade skills. Indigenous people, for the most part, those who had not died from European sickness, many had moved away from the population centers. The few that remained, most interestingly, would intermarry with the African populations. In fact, after the Pequot Wars in Connecticut in the end of the 17th century, the King Philip Wars in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, many of the surviving native men, these are the Pequots and Narragansetts in Rhode Island, Wampanoags in southeastern Massachusetts, many of the surviving men, and few survived, were sent to Bermuda in the West Indies as slaves. And it left, for the most part, the remaining indigenous population at that time were native women. Native women were not going to have common law relationships or interact with whites. So what did? They interacted with the African population. To this very day, many people who trace themselves with the ancestry of either Pequot, Wampanoag, or Narragansett look more like me than a Plains Indian. That was their creative survival to survive, to maintain some level of their culture and their ethnic identity. But what's most important to realize is that, and today's a very good example of it with the weather, very cold and very chilly. Here in New England, we have two consistent challenges, and particularly in agricultural-based economy. We have bad soil, a lot of sand and shale, and we have bad weather. So we're not growing the cash crops. Rice, tobacco, coffee, sugar isn't happening in New England. So our farms, for the most part, or our plantation, for the most part, were grazing plantations, were livestock plantations. In Rhode Island, western Rhode Island, we're raising horses. The Narragansett Pacer horse to be traded into the West Indies. So for the most part, we really don't have an agricultural-based economy. It's a maritime-based economy. It's a merchant trade. We are building and taking products and selling them back into the aftermarkets. It could be rum. It could be snuff making. It could be candle making. It could be fine furniture with the Quaker community. So these Africans, as they start to come into the community, are not working in any large plantation. For the most part, we find these Africans working in very urbanized seaport communities, and that's where their populations arrive. We also find that since these Africans are required to work in trade skills, it tends to take 5 to 6 to 7 years to apprentice to learn a trade. And at that time, it was very important to have a young child with life expectancy about the late 30s to early 40s. A young child at 5, 6, 7, and 8 would tend to be brought in as an apprentice over the next 5 to 6 years, and by the time they were 16, an adult, they would have a trade skill. So what we find that's quite unique and tied to our economy and tied to our limitations in our agricultural-based economy, we find that many of the merchants and families in New England are looking for and asking for and transporting children, African children, to New England. They're not looking for big, strong men to work in sugar plantations. They're looking for young children who are pliable, who are manageable, and most importantly, who are going to be trainable, who would then allow to be able to be trained and to enter the apprenticeship trade skills. So we have an assortment of primary evidence of ship logs and records where children as young as 5 and 6 are being brought from West Africa to the West Indies and eventually to Rhode Island. Now, there's a whole other lecture series of how children could survive that horrendous transatlantic trade, but they did. And for the most part, those that survive would come into the households and become active parts of the households of these New England families, particularly Newport. So how does that play out in Newport, this slavery religion at that time? Well, it's important to understand that the merchant class in Newport, and this is now the mid-18th century, they're seeing themselves as, again, very strongly anchored in their place of worship, Christians and Jews and the varieties of Christian denominations, but they're also anchored in their prosperity and their trade, which is largely tied to the triangular trade. So there was this rationale, as you begin to read some of the letters and the records and the interchange, this rationale that we, as a slave owner, do not own the person. We don't own the slave as a human being. We own their work. Their soul is with God, and only God can own a soul. Only God can take a soul and give it everlasting life. But during your time on earth, we own your work. So it was this rationale at the time and a belief at the time that ownership of an African in Newport and potentially giving them an opportunity to convert to Christianity was so much better for them than to be a pagan living in the wilds of Africa, in the jungles of Africa. And in fact, this belief was so persuasive. There's very few people in the mid-18th century that are debating this issue. As liberal as the religious conservatives were, liberal from an 18th century standpoint, there was very little outcry and very little discussions about the inhumanity of owning an African child or an African family. But again, you can understand the rationale at that time because this is an 18th century mindset, not a 21st century mindset. And again, in the case, and I have this all the time, it's always frustrating when I get commercial folks will contact me and TV stations, and they always want to know, who was the bad slave owner, who was the bad slave institution, and how many Thomas Jeffersons did you have in Newport? And the easier answer is, it was everybody. The easiest way to explain the African slave trade, it was the world's first equal opportunity employer. African kingdoms participated with every European that was on a ship of sail and that moved from old world to new world. And in the case of Newport, every religious group was involved, some more efficient than others, but to be patently truthful in the statement, it was a worldwide economy that made men and families and institutions wealthy beyond belief. And the participation was fully integrated across all religions and all organizations. In fact, it's a Quaker woman that makes this comment here in mid-18th century, still does custom keep men blinded. It's this custom of wealth, the custom of owning an African, the belief that owning an African service, but allowing his soul to meet Jesus and be converted was so much better than to allow them to remain pagans in the jungle. So it was a belief system that everyone believed in and everyone profited from. And this paradoxical time in men, I'll have two of these stories. The second story is someone very close to Yale, Reverend Ezra Stiles. But the first story is a very important man, a Jewish man, Isaac Eliezer of Newport. Isaac Eliezer arrives from New York. He, along with Aaron Lopez, are part of the earliest founding members of Congregation Jesuit Israel, which later they would contribute to building Turles Synagogue. Again, Jews who were merchants were involved in the trade. Jews who were not merchants were not involved in the trade. Quakers who were merchants, trade. Quakers who were not. So it had nothing to do with religion, but those who were merchants were in with both feet. Well, in the case of Isaac Eliezer, being a Jew, along with Aaron Lopez, both of them were active merchants. In fact, Aaron Lopez was the second largest property taxpayer in 1760. He had interest in over 50 sailing vessels. He was a man of great means, great employment, great wealth. Both of them had petitioned to the Rhode Island General Assembly to be naturalized citizens. The Rhode Island General Assembly came back and said, we've got an issue here. You're good citizens. You contribute everything that we'd want as a good person. But in our original 1663 charter, it specifically states that you are required to be a Protestant Christian to be a full citizen of this colony. So Rhode Island was not founded under religious freedom. Don't anyone tell you, or if any time you see it posted somewhere or stated somewhere, stop them. Rhode Island was not founded under religious freedom. It was founded under religious toleration. You would be tolerated. You would not be persecuted. But if you were not a Protestant Christian male property owner, you could not be a full citizen. So Isaac Eliezer, along with Aaron Lopez, twice petitioned to become citizens. Twice were denied. Both of them would retreat to Massachusetts. We hate this as Rhode Islanders to say this. Both of them would retreat to Massachusetts, become citizens there, never to be citizens in Rhode Island. But at the same time, Isaac Eliezer, as you can see, was putting out an ad for a runaway slave girl named Bina. We don't know anything about if she was returned. We don't know anything about Bina. All we know is this irony of this man who was being persecuted and not allowed to reap the benefits of full citizenship because he didn't worship as a majority religion, but was persecuting a fellow human being simply because she was of a different race. Unfortunately, this story played out each and every day and every year through all denominations of early colonial Newport. But there's a movement in early America, particularly New England, called the Great Awakening, that creates an opportunity of unprecedented proportions for the Africans. The Great Awakening, the best way to explain it, not being a divinity school student, is it's an 18th century evangelical movement where The church was trying to bring as many of these frontiers people and these people who were away from the Church of England, away from civilization in these early American frontiers, to bring them closer to God and the pathway to God through Jesus. And they were requiring that their ministers would go out and do everything they can to convert and to get people excited and engaged with the church. They also required that if you had a servant, see, here in New England, we're very genteel. Very rarely in the records of the 18th century, particularly in Rhode Island, do you see the term slave. It's servant. But let me be clear, servants were slaves in colonial New England. But as a part of the Great Awakening movement, you see this fast tracking of conversion. There's almost this race between different congregations all across New England, but particularly in Newport, to convert these Africans into Christianity. Now, it's important from a contextual standpoint of comparison. If you were an enslaved African in the Carolinas, it would have been against the law to have access to education. It would have been against the law for cohabitation. It would have been certainly against the law for religion. But here in New England, there are opportunities here because of the unique religious, economic, and even climate circumstance. Africans are having access to training because of the trade skill demand in education. They're having access to now religion. And the third point, which I kind of glossed over, when these children arrived here as enslaved Africans, they weren't living separate and apart from the family. They were living in the same home as the master and mistress. In many cases, children were sharing the same rooms as master and mistress children. As they got older, they would move out and live, if you're an old New Englander like our home, they would live in what is called the pantry. Because living in the pantry, you would have your cot where you slept, and then you had your workbench, and then you had doors leading outside or upstairs, but you didn't have to come through the main house. And then later, they would even move up and live in the, again, being an old New Englander, the garret or the attic. So you have this unique circumstance where Africans are working side by side, living side by side, and worshiping side by side. This would have been unheard of in the West Indies, or in the southern part of this country. But here in New England, it's this close proximity. There's this, what we call interdependence, that's throwing them together. And it's a great awakening that's creating this amazing movement of Africans that are moving into church and religion. And this is just some of the examples of many of some of the leading churches of that time and the leading clergy of that time, as they're almost boasting in their diaries, in their records, about how many Negroes, as they were described, are taking sermon or taking services and have been baptized and have been converted. So all through that mid-18th century, this race to conversion is moving most of the Africans closer, interacting with the larger white community. But there is one man, second important, possibly Yale Divinity School graduate after Ezra Stiles, Samuel Hopkins. Samuel Hopkins, who was brought to Newport in 1770 by Reverend Ezra Stiles. Reverend Ezra Stiles was at the time the pastor of the Second Congregational Church. Just to give you a sense of that time, 1770, the population is about 12,000, but Stiles' church had over 1,200 members. That's pretty sizable, the population. Ezra Stiles, I'm going to talk about him a little bit later, but in an introduction of Samuel Hopkins, Stiles was the Renaissance man of Newport. He was secretary of Redwood Library. He was also very engaged with the Jewish community. He learned Hebrew so he could sit in on services and somehow figure out how Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, connected with the New Testament. He also had a diary which exists today, which he took every mundane fact of day-to-day life, which is a wonderful recreation of colonial America, or at least from his eyes at that time. But in 1770, he brought his friend from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, Samuel Hopkins, to Newport. The installation sermon, which is a part of our family collection from March of that year, is, we're told by scholars, a 7-hour droning on of Ezra Stiles and the congregation. But in any case, Hopkins came, and when he arrived, he immediately became a firebrand and immediately decided that he would take up, in his interpretation of the Great Awakening, was that once Africans were converted to Christianity, that we will equal in all cases, including social and civic and class cases, under one God. Now, nobody believed that. Everyone at that point believed, at the very least, once you are converted and become a Christian, you see the light, the inner light, which is interpretation of Jesus, there's an equality under church. But there's no social equality. These are Africans. They are a different race, different species. But in Hopkins' case, no, they are equal. And Hopkins would literally demand that his own members of his congregation, he had about 800 members in his congregation at the First Congregational Church. What's really neat in Newport is these two buildings still stand. I'm always proud of this. I have to always, tout this. Newport has possibly, because sometimes Charleston challenges us, but I don't really believe in Charleston sometimes. Newport has probably the largest collection of pre-American Revolution historic structures, over 300, that still stand, including a number of religious institutions, which through adaptive reuse are now condos and mixed-use buildings, but the buildings themselves, much of the historical integrity and features still exist. Well, in the case of Hopkins, he felt so strongly that these Africans once converted are one, he also felt that we need to end this trade, this participation. He actually demanded that anyone within his church either leave the trade or leave his church. Most left his church. They either went over to Stiles' Second Congregational, or others went into other denominations. Hopkins also would write what we call today letters to the editor, kind of in the Newport Mercury newspaper, outing different merchants, different people, why they would do this, challenging them. I mean, he was a bit of a firebrand. He was not well liked at the time, obviously, in Newport, but he was someone who stood very strong in his convictions. Hopkins also brought a number of Africans into his church. He brought them actively involved within his church. In 1773, Hopkins approached Ezra Stiles and several other clergy and suggested that if we really want to accelerate the Great Awakening, we want to accelerate the conversion of Africans, let's train several Africans, let's educate them as missionaries and send them back to Africa or possibly to the West Indies to convert fellow Africans. And they actually interviewed several dozen Africans at that time because, again, as I had said, these Africans, they had trade, they had education, they had skills, they had religion. By 1770, 73, half the population of Africans are now free in Newport and are doing well from a 18th century perspective. And in 1773, two Africans, a John Comino and a Bristol Yum, are actually selected. They're sent to the College of New Jersey, which is today Princeton, and spend 2 years there. And today they're recognized as the first two African to enroll in a college. It's disrupted by a little thing called the American Revolution. Bristol Yama returns and relocates to Providence. John Comino signs on to a privateer. Many Africans would serve on privateers and was killed in the Battle of Block Island. But what's most important is Hopkins is bringing it to the next level. He's talking about an equality, at least under religious concernments, but an equality regardless of race. Hopkins today is recognized as the first true abolitionist. His home, his parish home, still exists, along with his church, and many of us in Newport revere Hopkins as one of the most important early Renaissance men of both religion and equal rights and civil rights of his time. But Ezra Stiles, the second paradoxal. Ezra Stiles, again, also believed in the conversion of Africans. He interacted with Africans quite frequently in his church, and he writes about them in detail in his diaries and quite affectionately. When those that died, he oversaw their burial services, he oversaw their eulogies, he would bring them into his private home for religious services. He was very connected in many cases, but also he was an 18th century man, for good or bad or indifferent. And we find by 1757, he actually orders, through a hogshead barrel of rum, a young boy from Guinea, who he renames Newport, and is a slave in his household for over 20 years. He eventually converts him to Christianity as a Protestant, brings him here when he arrives here as president of Yale, and then eventually frees him. And then we lose sight of Newport. So we have no idea where he would have went, where he might have died. And again, I've had Christian communities challenge me at the time, saying, how could someone as Ezra Stiles, this duplicity? And my response simply is, history is not black or white, it's more shades of gray. And it's really hard to be able to take 21st century social, economic, political views, religious views, and impose it upon an 18th century person or institution. He was a complex person, and he was an evolving person. And Hopkins evolved earlier as a humanist than possibly Stiles. But it's important to recognize that this level of complexity, whereas they would make individual decisions for comfort by having a slave, they were still working on the larger policy issues, the larger issues. And as I said, and this is an important slide to point out, these Africans that arrived here were working in the trades. And the easy example is they worked in nearly every trade. In fact, we have the Jewish merchants that would introduce two very important merchant technologies to Newport and really America at that time. One was chocolate grinding. And in fact, we have a half dozen free Africans listed as master chocolate grinders for Aaron Lopez. And they are grinding chocolate and being paid for the chocolate, and the chocolate's being sent out and sold off to markets and such. And these chocolate grinders are being paid per pound. And several of the men, later we'll talk about in more detail, become quite prosperous and promising leaders of the African community. We also see the Jewish merchants bringing in what is called spermaceti candle making. Spermaceti candles are mid-sized whales. At that time, they're waxy brain matter. This is a non-technical assessment. Their waxy brain matter was boiled and cured, and it made it into a candle. And spermaceti candles lasted 5 times longer than beeswax. It was kind of the ever-ready battery of the 18th century. And John and Obadiah Brown of Providence came together, the Jewish merchants in Newport, and formed the first American business cartel, the United Spermaceti Candle Making Company, by the 1760s. Many of the candle making manufacturers were Africans who were trade in that trade. So these Africans were not beasts of the fields. They were artisans, they were tradesmen and women and young children, and they were involved in nearly every aspect of building and maintaining the economy at that time. In fact, as you see at the bottom, all of our most significant institutions had African, not slave, but African skilled labor, both free and enslaved, participating in building these structures. And I remind people today in tours, if we recognize the historical and architectural masterpiece that these buildings are, shouldn't we also recognize the level of skills that those Africans had to build and construct these masterpieces? And the life of these Africans is quite extraordinary. I mean, one of the things that's been fun for me growing up in Newport and with a very strong old family is we always saw our African heritage from the perspective of who we were, how we survived, how we were able to overcome the circumstances. But more importantly, you know, I had grandparents, particularly my grandmother, that would remind me and take me to libraries saying, but this is what we also did. In fact, my grandmother had a saying as a boy that still resonates today. Slavery is how we got here, but it tells you little to who we are as a people. So slavery is how we got here, but it tells you little to who we are as a people. And in the case of this slide, these are not slaves. These are 3 couples who are having a picnic in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, about 5 miles north of Newport, and they're spending a day in 1766 having a picnic. We know this because Caesar Linden, who had a diary, the diary which still exists, what is today recognized in the Rhode Island Historical Society collections, is one of the earliest and most significant diaries of a free, enslaved, and later free African in early America. It's about a 4-year period, up to about 1770, in his day-to-day life. And in this diary, in this piece, he talks about having a picnic. He's so detailed about all the different goods that were brought on, from a pig to rum to green corn. But what we also know is that these 3 couples that are going, they're courting. Because within 2 years, all 3 are married in styles of Second Congregational Church. So despite the circumstances of arriving as chattel property, living in an enslaved condition, Africans still had the ability to connect at a level of courting or managing a family or managing a life. And the more that we look at this diary, the more that we look at the perspective of these early Africans, the better understanding we have of early America. Because again, it's not black or white. It's a very complex, very integrated system. We also know, and this is something very closely tied to Connecticut, as early as 1756, meaning the earliest primary record we have oral tradition that's earlier, but we know that happening in Newport, and then later we see it happening in New London County here, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, different locations. In June, Africans would come together and they would spend a day and sometimes 2 and 3 days, and they would select a tribal chief or a leader of the African community. The white community at that time interpreted it as a mocking of government. And in fact, it was called loosely, almost from a derogatory standpoint, Negro Election Day. They were kind of mimicking electing a governor, a royal governor. But it's not. Now that we look at it more carefully, and we've compared it with African scholars, that no, they're coming together in June. They usually are at similar locations, greens or common areas with large trees, and there they would make the decision to form this common law governor or tribal chief who would have some level of authority of managing the affairs of the African community in that community. Now, what's remarkable about it is, in the case of Newport, and again, we have great primary records, is it's a pretty orderly process, as you can see. I mean, you're required to have a pig to vote. I mean, kind of an early self-inflicted poll tax for the African community. But it was there, and they did. And in some cases, we have hundreds of Africans gathering over several days in Newport in selecting these tribal chiefs. And what's important here is that, and remember, most of the Africans that came here came from similar locations in what is Ghana today, in Guinea. So as they came here, they weren't blank slates. They had working knowledges, even as young children, of their language, their culture, their hierarchy system. And what we're finding is this is playing out everywhere in New England, and not only in Newport. Again, what we call today creative survival. Another important feature of their life together is their day naming traditions. Today, the Akan people of what is today Ghana, the day that you're born of a week, you're given a day name. The birth order, you're giving a birth order name. And these are quite common names. And in fact, names like Quash, which really is Quasi, is boys born on Sunday. Cujo is really Kojo, is boys born on Monday. Kofi, which is really Kofi, our just recently retired Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Amin from Ghana. Kofi is anglicized into, or phonetically, it's Cuff or Cuffy. We have thousands of Cuffs and Cuffies in Newport, thousands more across New England. In Jamaica, very English colony, every other family has a day name ascribed to that. And what we find in Newport, as Africans become free, and many who do convert to Christianity, will take a Christian name, but also revert back to their African name or day name, or give to their children or grandchildren both Christian and African day names. So it's important to recognize that these Africans, once they had an opportunity to free themselves, would still look to reclaim an African identity. Now, why this is important, and I emphasize this, because Africans who had the unfortunate circumstance to be enslaved further south from New England and certainly the West Indies, anything and everything of their African identity was nearly completely wiped out. Language, culture, customs, wiped out, unless they lived in separate environments or they would form in these clandestine environments where they would follow a religious pattern. But here in New England, they were able to keep and reclaim, and in fact, today in genealogy, many of the African communities that are tied to New England have as much of a chance to trace themselves back before the American Civil War than any other African American community across America, because of this opportunity where we kept records, were able to create some identity of an African identity here in New England, less so and almost unheard of further south. And by 1780, the African community does something that's the first time in the Western Hemisphere and quite unique. A group of 14 African men form and charter and organize the Free African Union Society. This Free African Union Society is initially established in Newport, and then later they would send out messengers and interact with African communities in Philadelphia, Providence, and Boston, and establish similar. Now, what's remarkable about this community to this day is the Newport Historical Society still has in its possession the original minutes, the day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year minutes from about 1785 to about 1820 of the society. The purpose of this society was really four very simple tasks. One was to ensure that every African conducted themselves in a proper and sober way, again, that Christian kind of influence on them. Second, that at any point that an African would die, and unfortunately living in the 18th century, and particularly a seaport, death was a frequent occurrence, that every African would be afforded a proper burial and a proper marker. Third, they wanted to ensure that every African had an opportunity to be educated, and later on they would establish a school. Then the fourth, which is interesting, and it only happens as much in Newport, they want to return to Africa. They want to be sent back to Africa, like the American colonization movement that would come years later. They wanted to return to their motherland. So this African Union Society becomes quite significant, and through their minutes, we have a window into the day-to-day lives of not chattel property, not beasts of the fields, not slaves, but African men, women, and children. And it's important to understand, they saw themselves and wrote about themselves as Africans. There's no such thing as African American. They didn't look like me. They look like someone who is today from Ghana, or from Guinea, or from Senegal. And in fact, in their letters, they would actually reject descriptions such as Negro or black, because that's not us. That's white interpretation of us. We're African. So it's important to recognize that this Union Society was able to provide a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, and most importantly, to begin to help define who we are as free African men, women, and families in this early America. And this is just one of the letters that they sent in 1789 that they're sending to Providence African community. And look what they say. We, the members of the Union Society Newport, taking into consideration the calamitous state into which we are brought by the righteous hand of God, being strangers and outcasts in a strange land. They themselves recognize that this is not our land. And it's important to recognize that many of the Africans in Newport at that time are still second generation, so they have an African connection. Later in 1789 is a second letter that they actually send to Boston, and this is an interesting circumstance. In the case of sending this letter to Boston, they sent it to a man named Prince Hall. Prince Hall is an enslaved and later free African, we think possibly born in Barbados. But in any case, Prince Hall today is recognized as establishing the first black Masonic order, the Prince Hall Masons, in America. They send a letter to him introducing him to a Henry Stewart. Henry Stewart is from Philadelphia. He is a member of the African Union Society in Philadelphia, and he's introducing them. And what's remarkable at that time is the Newport Africans are asking Prince Hall in Boston, they're asking these two gentlemen, a Reverend Richard Allen in Philadelphia, who establishes the first Mother Bethel Black AME church in America, and a second African, a Absalom Jones, who establishes a African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas in Philadelphia, and he's asking them, would you join us in raising money and consciousness to return to Africa? Now, what happens, kind of a very short synopsis, is Prince Hall basically says, we think the future is civic organizations, Masonic organizations, and we think our future as Africans in America is to embrace, because we find that once we become a Mason, we are treated equally by fellow white Masons. That's the pathway for our prosperity in America. So thank you, Newport, but we're not going back to Africa. In Philadelphia, Reverend Richard Allen, Reverend Absalom Jones basically say, thank you for the correspondence, but we believe the pathway is through Christ and through religion. And as we form strong, highly identified black churches, that will form the basis for us to achieve full equality in America. So thank you, we're not going back to Africa. But what's most important about this dialogue in the 1780s and 1790s, Africans are talking about their identity, their self-determination, and the future of what African life in America would be. Now, it's important to recognize that African women in Newport were allowed to be members of the African Union Society, but the men wouldn't let them vote. So by 1809, the women said, we don't have enough of this, and we're going to form our own. So the first free African female benevolent society in America is founded in Newport in 1809. We know that because two of the women who are outstanding women, Arbor Tanner and Sarah Lina, they actually correspond frequently with the men. They also suggest that the one thing that we would focus on, separate from helping widows and their children, we like to be able to form a school. A little side note on Arbor Tanner. How many have ever heard the name Phyllis Wheatley? You ever heard of Phyllis Wheatley? She's kind of well known. Phyllis Wheatley is the first African-American poet in early America. Phyllis Wheatley from Boston, her close friend was Arbor Tanner, and there are about 11 surviving actual letters between the two. And Phyllis Wheatley's first published poem in 1767 is not Boston, it's not Connecticut, it's actually Newport. And more importantly, Arbor Tanner is giving her guidance on her marriage, giving her guidance on her life. In their letters, they're talking freely about life from a perspective of being an early African and what it's like and now being a Christian. So what's important here is that these African women are educated, they're organized, and they're interacting within their community and within their sphere of other Africans across New England. This was unheard of anywhere else in any large degree where Africans, unfortunately, were largely enslaved in the South and certainly the West Indies. And as I said, the African Female Benevolent Society with the African Union Society very early on, by March of 1808, they're establishing a school. Newport, by about a month, establishes the first free African school by about a month from the Boston group. And our definition and our interpretation of the first and free is it's organized by the African community, it's chartered by the African community, the funds raised for the school materials and activities is raised by the African community, and most importantly, the teachers are African. Before that, you had good Quakers and other good white folks educating and providing some access to education and training, but this is a case where the African community is forming their own school called the African School on School Street in Newport for the benefits of the African community. And as you can see here, this is an advertisement in the Newport Mercury. They're actually advertising it, saying it's free. Send your kids to school and come to school. And up here to my right, you can see a list of a class of students from March 23rd, 1809. And interestingly, you're losing the African names. You're starting to get traditional Christian names. These are now second and third generation. So they're moving away from being African and more being what today we call African American. And probably the most important circumstance that would change really America and establish America is the American Revolution, but it also provided a further opportunity for Africans to better themselves. In Rhode Island by 1778, by February, like most of the Continental Army forces, they were depleted. Rhode Island would pass an ordinance to the General Assembly to allow enslaved Africans, mulattoes, which are mixed Indian Africans for the most part, and indigenous people to be able to become active participants in 2 Rhode Island regiments. A first regiment is formed, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. It's integrated. It has largely enslaved, some free Africans, some Indians, and some whites, but it becomes the first time in America where an organized, chartered fighting force actively and officially includes Africans. And they participate in the Battle of Rhode Island in August of that year. They participate in all the battles going forward. In fact, the image at the bottom comes from a French young lieutenant who was also a painter and who arrived in Newport with Rochambeau and then later to Yorktown. And he was just very taken by these American soldiers. And he actually has an image on the left of a Rhode Island 1st Regiment soldier. And as you can see, he's wearing a white buckskin uniform and he's wearing his helmet, and it has our symbol of Rhode Island, which is the anchor of hope. So these Africans, by the end of the American Revolution, had arrived. They were largely free. Rhode Island would have a gradual Emancipation Act by 1784, but by 1795 to 1800, a large portion, nearly all the Africans are now free. So I'm going to end my presentation with the last kind of connection to the African community, which is their burial place. And this is very special to me because my wife and I, my wife Teresa, I work for her, it's her company, and she's a designer and she's a historian, has done much of the work, and we've been spending about 30 years restoring and now interpreting our cemetery in Newport. Newport has some of the oldest colonial cemeteries in America, dating back to the 1660s, our common burying ground. But there's an 1.5 acre section of that common burying ground that originally, by 1705, our first primary source record, it became a burying area for enslaved Africans, and then later free Africans, and then later most immigrant groups. But by the mid-19th century, the African-American community would call it God's Acre or God's Little Acre. And today, it has the largest and oldest repository of existing original markers of enslaved and free Africans, some dating back to the 17th and many clustered in the 18th century. It's a very special place. And again, my wife has led the effort with the city to restore and interpret, and we have about 300 remaining markers that are left. It's a very special cemetery because many of the Africans would actually that were stonemasons, would carve the markers. The African Union Society would see to it that Africans, regardless of class or social staff, free or slave, would be able to have a marker. And just to provide, again, a context, it was rare in the 18th century for anyone to have a stone marker. It was rare. It was an expense that very few could afford. But here in Newport, these Africans who were tradesmen, who were free, or who had lived within well-to-do families, had access to the opportunity to have these markers that are left behind. And many of them, in the case here, Violet from Cape Coast James, the markers are quite descriptive of who they were, how they lived, and most importantly, eventually how they would die. And the Free African Union Society actually organized a Paul and Bears Society so they could see to the actual procession of a burial. They could see to the purchasing of a marker, the inscription. Any member would be able to have a marker paid for regardless of their social circumstance or their economic circumstance. In that cemetery, out of the 300 surviving markers we have, I would probably say that about 100, a little less than 100, are of children. Now, mostly from the standpoint that children, like seniors of that time, were most susceptible to disease and death. And that would be in any common burying ground at that time. But what I wanted to leave you with is kind of a 4-minute audio, which is going to introduce you to some of the markers here, but the markers of the children. And one of the things that we're going to try to do, and I hope if there's anything I've done in this presentation, and if we can get feedback later, is I've tried to emphasize the fact that there are no slaves here and no chattel property here. These were flesh and blood human beings. They were men, they were women, and you'll see they were children. And they lived full lives and creative lives despite arriving under the worst circumstance. And as I present history today, it's my obligation to present the history of the people, not the institution. So hopefully these last 4 minutes, you'll have an introduction of a little piece of our cemetery and of our African children through their markers in our remembrance.
Broken down and tired, living life on the merry-go-round. You can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Ooh, mountain, we gon' walk it out. Ooh, mountain. And I rise up like the day. I rise up afraid. I rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I rise up like the waves. I rise up in spite of the age. I rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. The silence isn't quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Ooh, mountain, bring it to its feet. Ooh, mountain. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up afraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. All we need is hope, and for that we have each other, and for that we have each other. And we'll rise, rise like the day, rise up in spite of the age.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being so patient. About 300 years of history in an hour. I'm certainly welcome to answer any questions you might have. I know this is being recorded, so we're asking that anyone has a question either come up at a mic, and if not, I'll try to repeat the question and we can make sure we have it on tape. So please, any questions you might have. Yes?
I'm interested if you could elaborate on your interpretation of the relationship between religious pluralism and commerce. And is there anything to the idea that Newport's role in the slave trade might be explained by this culture of religious pluralism as opposed to being something that happens in spite of it?
The question about really the connection between religious pluralism and commerce, and one of the things that's interesting from my perspective in Newport is that by the very fact that Rhode Island generally, particularly Newport, opened its arms to anyone and everyone, regardless of the religious pursuit, it began to attract a level of diversity that was almost unheard of in other British and certainly other colonies. So, as I'd said before, Jews arrived by about 1657, 1658, Quakers around the same year. They bring with them their access to world markets, their trades, their technology. Even with the exhibit today, some of the finest of the fine American furniture makers are Quakers and Quaker families. So what you find, which I think is a parallel today, the more diverse community, the more of a connected a community is to world markets and broader markets diversity, the more robust the economy would be and the benefits of a diverse commerce. On the flip side, in the 17th and 18th century, what would become the world guiding economy was the triangular trade, was the enslavement of Africans. So Newport would almost simultaneously be very much tied to that. And we know that by the end of the 17th century, Newport is one of the first of the English colonies that actually has a head tax on the importation of slaves and dedicates that head tax to public benefits. Our public wharfs, public streets, public infrastructure, our marketplace, or granary are all constructed through this tax. So there is a correlation. The positive side is it creates a diverse and robust and sustainable international economy. The challenge of that is that it also imports, or that economy is basically, the underpinning of it is the importation of the work of enslaved Africans. Next question, please. Yes?
Several parts. First, I was curious as to whether these free Africans were set free by their masters, or there was some way they purchased their freedom? How did that happen?
No, that's a great question. The question is that how did the Africans become free? It's complicated and it's diverse. In some cases, they are emancipated by will. In other cases, they purchase their freedom. In the Christian community at that time, Sunday was a day of rest, and Africans had the ability, after they attended service, to apply their own trade, to either work on the side or to sell products in a market, and they were able to accumulate wealth and purchase freedom from that. We also have, which is kind of a unique circumstance, at that time, being in Connecticut, I'm not a gaming person, I know you have casinos here, but at that time, lotteries were a means of raising public dollars for public benefits, public conveyance. And several Africans, we have cases that participated in the lottery, won, and used the proceeds to purchase their freedom. So again, this is a part of the creative survival scenario. They used anything and everything at their disposal to bring themselves into a position of freedom. Really what happens by the end of the American Revolution, the British occupation of Newport destroys much of Newport. It disables our maritime commerce. The fleet doesn't exist. So for the most part, there's no demand or need for slaves. So slavery was dying out generally in New England after the American Revolution, but particularly in the port communities. And we know that because as we look at the census and the records, by 1800, nearly all the Africans and now some African Americans are largely free across New England.
Yes, I noticed your frequent use of the Sankofa bird and other Adinkra symbols. Did you find any tracings of those on the tombstones or in other material that you located?
No, thank you. That was a great question. No, we've not. I mean, obviously we do Sankofa because it's come get it. It's a look back in history, and it's very representative of our program. But no, we've not seen any of that. For the most part, the Africans, their day names are directly tied to their African identity and culture. We do know that in the case of 2 existing colonial buildings in Newport that are managed by the Newport Historical Society, that where Africans were living in the garret or the attic, that they were keeping feathers in shells and such, you know, very much within certain religious traditions. But we have no other evidence of any of the Akan symbols or such during the colonial period. What you find with the Africans is that they've now kind of adopted, like any immigrant. In fact, one term that I used with Africans is they were forced immigrants, but they were immigrants. Because when you think of a term of an immigrant, that person's not a blank slate. They're bringing their culture, their music, their language, their religion. They're bringing all these things, and they're mixing it all up, and it's becoming North America, South America, the West Indies. But when you use the term slave, you think of a thing, a property. So Africans were forced immigrants. And what they would do is they would bring religion, they would bring things, but in their naming, they would tend to integrate. So as an example, you saw one of the markers of a boy. His name was Solomon Nuba Tike. Solomon's his Christian name. His father, whose name was Nuba Tike, when he was enslaved, he became Arthur Flagg. He was a rope maker. When he became free, he went back and he named himself Arthur Tike. And then his son, he would give his Christian name, but also his African name. So you see that quite frequently, but no symbols, and they might be there, but that might be new discovery, but no symbols that we have found to this date. Yes.
My name is Charles Riley. I'm the librarian for African Studies here. I have an ancestor, John Coddington, who's buried in Newport. And I'm a fellow of Ezra Stiles College. I was interested in the 11-year-old boy that Stiles purchased. You said he's from Cape Mount, and if so, that would be a part of the Guinea coast that's now in present-day Liberia.
That's correct.
It's largely Vai-speaking. So there's some indication from just his origin that he may have been someone who spoke Vai. And if that's true, there are manuscripts in the Vai language, in the Vai script, that are held at Harvard University from the early 1830s to about the 1840s. They probably won't shed light on Newport specifically, but they would be of interest in terms of the surrounding context.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I thank you very much for sharing that, because I think what you were able to do is present the fact that by knowing more of the Africans as human beings, as viable, interesting human beings, there's a whole field of study that allows us to be able to learn more about their language, their customs, their culture, their religion, a whole field of study that has been literally been restricted because we're so focused on the trade. We're so focused on the institution. And I think through collections across the world and holdings across the world, there is tremendous amount of records, primary and secondary source records, that can help us unfold not only the history of the African people, but the history of the Americas. Because again, they, for the most part, were the workers, the builders, the providers, the supporters. And to learn more about who we are as Americans or South Americans or anywhere within the Western Hemisphere, you have to learn more about these early Africans. I didn't have one slide here because I was trying to keep it short, but Professor Eric Foner from Columbia University, who's probably the most renowned historian on African-American history, particularly the Reconstruction era, back in, I think, 98, President Clinton had this symposium on race and reconciliation, and Professor Foner presented a fact, which is an important one. Between 1500 and about 1800, just that 300-year slither, there are about 12.5 million people that went from Old World and settled in New World. That's everyone. That's the Pilgrims, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese. Out of that 12.5 million people, 10 million were Africans. So just by the sheer numbers of Africans coming to this new world and settling, their language, their customs, their food stuff, all of it has as much influence as any other ethnic, racial, or religious group. But it's all been buried, and it's my interpretation, it's been buried because we're so focused in talking about the property, the institution. I can tell you, my daughter's here, so maybe she can attest to this. I really could care less if Thomas Jefferson owned slaves or George Washington owned slaves. Who didn't own slaves in the 18th century? But I do care about the lives of those Africans who lived enslaved in Monticello, and how they lived, and how they married, and how they interacted, because that's going to give me a better understanding of early Virginia plantation economy. It'll give me a better understanding of Jefferson as a man, and it'll give me a better understanding and a pride of who I am. So thank you for that question, and thank you for that information. Yes, please.
Another question about burial traditions. As some African tribes had head and foot markers for burial, was there any such thing happening in Newport? Was this both a head and a foot marker?
They did. They had traditional heads and foot markers. Unfortunately, the challenge in that burying ground, time, age, vandalism, a variety of things, bad city management with weed whackers. Weed whackers are the most awful creation for historic cemeteries, because the stripes that you see across all those slate markers, that's what it's from. So we've lost many. But we probably have, I have to defer to my wife because she's on the Historic Commission, we probably have about 100 or so footstones that are remaining. In the case of the footstone, it would have not even, sometimes initials, won't even have the name. It'll have initials, and in other cases, it'll just have a date. So it's been a real challenge as we start to restore and reinterpret and reclaim the cemetery. We've done some ground-penetrating radar, and believe it or not, which is good news, many of the stones didn't break or were taken away. They toppled and just sunk into the earth. So at some point, we have to kind of come back to this cemetery and work on recovering, restoring these markers. Again, we have about 300 remaining, but there was probably about 3,000 at some point peaking by the end of the 18th or early 19th century.
Is it fair to say that there would have been both a head and foot marker as a typical burial?
Yes, on a consistent basis, Christians and through the African Union Society, they would have had a headstone and a footstone. And in fact, the children, they're all miniature size. It's kind of interesting. Free Africans' headstones are much larger, more descriptive. Enslaved Africans, where the stones are cut by the master, it's usually a lesser material slate, and there's less information, or the information is very much tied to the master. We have markers that say they were beloved servant. Again, never slave, but servant, beloved servant. But in the African free, and this becomes an interesting circumstance, is we consistently see the parents or the surviving family members stating their date of death, their year of death, down to the month, to the day. Now, for African American genealogy, that is important because, unfortunately, for any Africans who were enslaved in the South and elsewhere, having a burial marker is rare. I mean, they've brought me to the Bahamas, to Dominican Republic, to Barbados, Jamaica, and we just can't find enslaved cemeteries because they're just gone or they never existed. And even here in America, as we work with groups, as they're finding markers, it's very, very difficult because there's a lack of detail. The Newport Africans wanted to have that sense of place, that sense of detail. And in one case, I wish I could show the slide again. In several cases, at the time of death, you had a death head or an angel. Several of the Africans would carve angels with African features. And I should show you that too, because that's a neat thing. Let's see if I can find this. Should I show you that? Or are you going to trust me? All right, it's the one there left there. That's Pompey Brenton, who was an African governor. I did it. And if you look at the death head there, it doesn't look too much like Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson there. He actually has more African features. And there are several female markers that have angels that have the similar features. And I think what's most important about that is that it's a sense of identity. It's a sense of existence. And, you know, my wife and I have run a number of history tours there, and we had a group several years ago of African-American children. A little girl looked at that and said, "Oh my goodness, it looks like," she was Dominican, "it looks like my poppy." And that got, I mean, I'm sure a puppy didn't look exactly like that, but what was exciting was this little Dominican girl could identify with something in American history. It wasn't just the same old colonial European-looking features. She saw a 1772 marker in someone that looked like someone like her family. That might inspire her someday to be the next great historian. We don't know. So, yes, the markers that exist were quite detailed with information, with the physical features, the size, the shape. Hopefully, over the years, as we start to recover markers, we might find more information. Thank you. Yes.
So you alluded to relations between indigenous peoples and slaves, and I'm wondering if you have what you know, or if there's any evidence of that happening in Newport.
Today or then?
Then, of course.
Again, it's another part of that creative survival. We see in the Pequot Wars in the mid-late 17th century here in Connecticut what we call the King Philip Wars with the Narragansetts and the Wampanoags in Rhode Island, in the southeastern Massachusetts. As I had said, most of the males who were not killed were enslaved and sent off. And we find in primary source records by about the 1730s and 40s, Rhode Island is actually enacting laws that forbid Native women from purchasing enslaved Africans because they're doing it for family relations and not for work. And they're complaining in what we call Narragansett County, the west side or south county of Rhode Island on the Connecticut border. They're depleting some of the workforce. So by the early 18th century, Native women and African men are forming common law relationships, forming family systems. Where it gets complicated is how they're described and how in census they're being interpreted. In fact, the term mestizo, mulatto here in English, is almost always New England black native mixture standpoint. The challenge is that later in the 19th century, you might see Indian, and then later it becomes Negro. And in fact, many people who are largely of native ancestry in New England, they're starting to be listed as Negro or black by the mid-19th century, and it's wiping out their identity and such. And unless they were either Narragansett, Pequot, or the few who had consistent identity and were able to get tribal recognition, there are thousands and thousands of people in New England that have this ancestry, but it's very difficult and impossible to trace or track just because of the collusion by census takers and by the larger society of really mixing the two from the standpoint. It's interesting, even my own family, because on my Connecticut family side, which is Bridgeport, a little neighborhood called Little Liberia, which was the earliest black community in Connecticut in the 1830s, that was largely founded by African American, and Native people. And on my maternal grandfather's side, we have a Pocasset Indian, which is an offshoot of the Pequot Indians. But they intermarried with the African community. And, you know, for the most part, they were seen as Indian for the first part, and then over the last century, they've been seen as African American or black. So it's a challenge sometimes in peeling through the information in census. And it's sometimes looking at the oral traditions. And as someone who's a public scholar, I can say that oral traditions are more accurate than sometimes we allow to realize. And when you take an oral tradition as a basis of information, who that person is, where they lived, what they ate, how they worship, and you connect that with any of the sources you might have, you're finding that the oral traditions weren't far off. And we feel that in African American and ethnic studies, there needs to be a better exploration of oral traditions. We think that's a whole area of unveiling and peeling back the history of people of color in this country.